Right. Okay. Cool. So let's flip the coin. What parts of this idea of power and privilege were you dreading? Were you hoping that we would not talk about? If I hear this one more time, my head might explode. I'll leave the room. You know, what kinds of things around privilege and power were you hoping we would not talk about? Yep. Yep. So we certainly won't do that. That's not my mo, and I don't think that that's helpful. And hopefully you'll see or hear through our presentation ways that allow us to kind of move forward as a family of human beings. So cool. So with that, the air being clear around that, let's go ahead and get started. And so, first of all, what I'd like for you to do in your handout on page 1, you see diversity, equity, and inclusion. You see privilege and power. And what I'd like for you to do is to write down your definition of privilege and power. So, what do you think those two words mean? You can write that right on the top part of that front page. If you like, you can write it right next to the words. But what do you think is privilege and power? What do you think those words mean? And I'll give you about 30 or so seconds to kind of think about that. All right. Who is the woman in the back row with the sweater and the light blue top? What is your name, ma'am? What's that? Angeline. So Angeline will be I will look to Angeline to see if the rest of the group is ready. So once Angeline stops writing, then I know we're ready to move on. So her hands are up, so we're ready to move on. So what I'd like for you to do is, if you can get into groups of 2 or 3 and just talk about your definitions or what you thought about when you think about privilege and power. All right. So if you can get into groups of 2 or 3, I'll give you 2 more minutes to just kind of have a conversation about those 2 terms. All right. So go ahead, find elbow partners, people next to you. Time starts now. 4, 3, 2, 1, stop. So if I can have at least someone from those groupings or those pairings just kind of talk about what were some of the words that are associated with privilege and power that you came up with in your discussions. Resources. And an advantage. Okay, so you're born into. Okay, so it's defined by that society. All right. Okay, advantages. Cool, cool, cool. Great, great stuff. Thank you so much for being critical in your thinking about that. And many of the concepts that we'll share really start with that kind of framework, right? So I also have a presupposition, right? So I come to this conversation with some thoughts and ideas, and one of those is that life is hard. It's hard for all of us. My daughter was born at 31 weeks in January 8th, and she was a tiny little peanut, and we struggled a great deal with her in the hospital. We had the best medical care that we could possibly find. She's doing great now. She was born 3 pounds. She's now like 9.5, 10 pounds, right? So she's doing well. But just watching that really confirmed for me the difficulties of life. And I can't imagine at 31 weeks being born in another country. I can't imagine not being in an urban area where medical facilities are readily available, right? So being in a rural area. So I want us to recognize that life is hard for all of us. And you'll hear, people complain about, what people typically call first world problems, right? So, my latte wasn't hot enough. Somebody took my parking space, all those kind of first world things. And I want to say that those have some psychological ramifications that lead us to have hard lives. But I also want to recognize that as hard as life is, the beauty of life is navigating it, is figuring out how to make a life out of things that are that can be difficult. And so at the bottom of your page, you'll see there are two positions. One is here, and the other is there. And what I'd like for you to do, just with thinking about here and there, here is kind of either your current state or the state that you started out in, right? And so there is ultimately your goal or the thing that you're aspiring to achieve. And so what I'd like for you to do is to think about what is one of your heres. What were some of your starting points? And you can use your childhood as an example. You can use, your career, your education. What is your starting point or your present state? What is your here? And then what are the positives and negatives of staying there? And then what are the positives and negatives of moving from here? So one example might be, as a 19-year-old, I chose to kind of move out of my parents' house. And there were some positives for if I stayed there, but there were also some negatives if I stayed there. And there were positives and negatives if I moved. So I want you to just spend, 30 or 45 seconds really thinking about your starting point. So what were the things how did you start out? What is your starting point? And again, you can use your education, your learning, your family, however you want to do that. But I want you to kind of write out what is your starting point or what was your starting state. All right? So if you saw the movie The Jerk, he was a poor black child from Mississippi. Right. So what were some of your starting points? All right. So now that you've thought about your starting points, and I know it's a little bit ambiguous. It's a big question, and you're not quite sure where to start. So I'm glad that you selected some place to start. But I also want you to think about what is your end goal. So when you have been successful in either your life or your career or your education, what does there look like, or what is there? So what are you moving towards? What are you trying to get to? So for some people, it could be financial stability, it could be relational, it could be the attainment of some material good or wealth. What is that there for you? For some folks, it could be a peace of mind, right? So I'm looking to. All right. So this is the last part that I want you to do with this particular exercise. So there is here where you've started from, and there is there where you're headed. And in between here and there are these obstacles. And what I'd like for you to do, for each one of those circles represents an obstacle. And so I want you to write down what are some obstacles that you've either encountered or anticipate encountering as you move from your current state or your here to your goal, which is your there, right? So what are some obstacles that you've either faced or you might anticipate facing as you move from here to there? I know this might seem like it's not related, but hopefully you'll see where we're going as we develop this model. All right. What I'd like for you to do now is, I know I haven't given you enough time to complete this whole assignment, but what I would like for you to do is to get into another group of three or four that's different than the one you were just in, and have conversations about this map that you've just created. This you're here, you're there, and the obstacles or challenges that you might face on your journey there. And I'll give another about 3 minutes, that's about a minute a person, to kind of talk about those things. All right? Your time starts now. 30-second warning. Four, three, two, one, and game over. So, so I am curious as to what were some of the challenges that people said that they were facing moving from here to there. What were some challenges or things that people could perceive as challenges as they move from here to there? Okay. Okay. Cool. So accepting things for what they are, right? What's another Okay, what's another challenge from moving here to there that people notice or themes that may have come up? Fin- Financial resources, wealth, okay? Health, okay? Age, yeah. Was there anyone that didn't have any challenges as they were moving from here to there? Was there? All right, cool. So everybody had challenges, and so to go to this point that life is hard and that navigating it from, we're always moving from here to there. I mean, that's the nature of human beings. And I also think it's funny when people say, well, I'm 100% dot dot dot. Well, that's probably not true because humans have moved all over the planet and we're all a mixture of something, even if there's a higher concentration of this, that, or the other from, our own backgrounds. But we're always in a state of movement. And so we're always facing challenges. And I wonder, so I have a hypothesis on some of the challenges that we face, particularly on an individual level. And I wonder, did anyone write down their gender identity or gender expression as a challenge? Okay, so one person did that. All right. Did anyone write down their race or ethnicity as one of those challenges that they face? Their race or ethnicity. Okay. Was there anything there about, in terms of the challenges that you face, about the your sexual orientation as a challenge? No. Okay. Was there anything about your religion as being a challenge or barrier for you getting from here to there? Okay, cool. Hopefully, I hope you are starting to see where I'm going with this, which is that for many of us, we all face challenges, but for some of us, there are very specific things that are added challenges. So to say that someone just has a pure privilege does not take into account very systemic things, but to also not recognize that there are some systemic things that impact individuals in very different ways is also somewhat disingenuous, right? And so, as a black man, the spaces that I walk in to those spaces with privilege and with power. right? So I'm 6'2", I'm cisgendered, which means that my outward appearance of my gender is congruent with my biology, and I act in a very oftentimes typical male fashion, right? I'm a conservative Christian. English is my first language. I have matriculated through universities and have degrees and letters after my last name. I don't have any felonies. I am mildly attractive and extremely humble, right? And so all of those things provide me a certain amount of privilege in spaces that I walk in. However, those same privileges in one context can feel like liabilities in another context. And so sometimes, I don't know if anyone's heard the expression, or people talk about white privilege. Has anyone ever heard of that conversation? Right? So I would say that white privilege does exist, and it is something that we have to be mindful of. But I would also suggest that we have to be mindful of all of our privileges, right? So as a so-called able-bodied person, if I'm not mindful that I have that systems have been set up for me to benefit or to continue on being able-bodied, or to make my able-bodied life better, I have to keep that in mind when I encounter someone who needs assisted or adaptive technology to move in the same space, right? And so that when we talk about power and privilege, I think that white privilege is something we need to be mindful of, but just as mindful as our heterosex privileges, right? Those of us who are heterosexual, the society rewards our ability to get married and have life insurance and that kind of stuff. And in a great society like this, should that not be available for all citizens, right? So that's something to kind of think about. So if we go to page 2, so I talked a little bit about my own privilege. So at the top are some things to kind of consider. And there are 3 ways in which I kind of operate, or things that I think about when I'm in this space. One is human motivation. And what are the core or the roots of human motivation? We're all looking for safety, significance, and belonging. We're all looking to be physically, mentally, socially, and spiritually safe, to demonstrate our significance, our purpose, and our power is our significance. And we want to be in relationships with people who understand our significance, right? Who understand our purpose. And so that's our core human motivation. The other thing that I really strive to help us focus on is this cognitive control. That there are some things that I don't believe that human beings have instincts. I think that there are things, though, that become so ingrained in our human nature that it is something we have to be mindful of, right? Some folks refer to that as sin, others, the worst of human nature, the dark side, if you will. But I also believe that we can have cognitive control over our the nature that is not as positive, or that does not lead us to advance as a species, right? And part of that is taking cognitive control over our implicit bias, our microaggressions, those little things that we do to people that are annoying. I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you, I'm not, but I'm not trying to lift you up as a human being, right? Gossip is one of those things. We can take cognitive control over prejudice. And it really is not about fault, but it is about responsibility, right? All of us probably have either ridden in a car or drive a car that has a blind spot. And it is not our fault that our cars have blind spots, but we do take the responsibility for those blind spots as we go about our daily activities. And then lastly, there's the legal framework of talking about diversity and inclusion, and why we're even talking about this idea of privilege and power. And that's because of the great land that we live in. Our Constitution and the preamble to the Constitution provides for us a landscape that suggests that we need to be talking about these important things, because bringing everyone into American society is extremely important and valuable to us as an idea, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So sometimes people will say, well, this diversity sensitivity stuff, it's, where does it end? It's going too far. Anyone ever heard someone say something similar? You raise your hand if you have. Okay, then you're fortunate if you haven't heard someone say that, right? But the I'd rather not talk about the end. Where does this end? Why are we doing too much? And really focus on that beginning. And that Declaration of Independence, paragraph 2 that I just recited, really gives us guidance on how we're supposed to be as a nation, and what the founding fathers had in mind, even if they could not live up to the entirety of that great and beautiful vision. And so it's our responsibility to help fulfill that great and powerful vision, even if it did not appear or feels like it didn't include all of us, right? So at the bottom of your page, I want you to think about your own privilege. So what privileges do you have? And if you could put those in that box, that would be great. What are some privileges that you have? For some of us, we were born in the United States. For some of us, English has been our primary language. For some of us, we are tall. For some of us, we have flowing locks of hair. For others of us, we have intellectual prowess, or there's some things that have benefited us. And if you think about those privileges, also think about the relationship to those challenges, right? Is it possible that you have some privileges that could help you overcome some of those challenges that you have? So what are your privileges? And we will define those. So don't fret that you're asking me to say something that we haven't defined yet. But we will define those. All right. And I also want you to think about let's go ahead and define this. So when we talk about this idea of privilege, we're actually talking about access to ... right? So in what ways do you have access to the things that you need, right? To securing your safety, significance, and belonging. And so for some of those things are resources, they are mindsets, they are cultural adaptations that allow us to get to the safety, significance, and belonging. And so this idea of power, as Todd Klein, my middle school science teacher, taught, that power is the ability to do work, right? And so privilege is the access, the ability to gain access to those things, where power is the ability to secure and use those things, right? And is it possible that your privilege can turn into power, right? So these abilities that you have can turn into power. The thing that I want us to be critical about is it possible that the things that provide me privilege could actually be a liability if I change environments? If I change environments, could it be a liability? And so one way to kind of think about that is, so privilege is contextual, right? So it's based on a context. And so when people talk about white privilege, what they're talking about is a very large and broad context that it was designed for the people who designed it to benefit the people who designed it. But simultaneously, we have smaller contexts or different contexts where that white privilege may not necessarily manifest itself as a privilege in a smaller context, right? So that's something to kind of keep in mind, that privilege is really about this access where power is about the ability to use that access or to gain that access. All right. So where is your privilege? Where is your power? So if you turn to page 3. So when we talk about this idea of power and privilege, I think it's important to recognize that it really is about having conversations that are respectful conversations, that are about respect. And so if you see that picture of the man eating and the young child sitting next to him, what are some things that come up for you when you look at that, particularly in relationship to privilege and power? What do you see there? Yep, 5 reasons we don't get respect. 5 reasons we don't get it. So what does that picture evoke, particularly when we talk about this idea of privilege and power? The haves and the have-nots, right? It reminds you of the United States and how we kind of function in the world, right? All right, other folks. So there are 2 points that I just want to kind of make. Well, actually 3 points I want to make with this particular page, and then we'll move on. And you can read those, and you can have the perspective, and kind of do the mental gymnastics of going through that list. But I do want to pay particular attention to point number 2 on that page, which is earning my respect. And how many people have heard that respect has to be earned? Raise your hand if you've heard that stated, that respect has to be earned. And I would say that is probably a fallacy for leadership. Right, so maybe that works for folks who aren't leading or guiding anything, but how easy is it to be nice to someone who is nice to you? Is that relatively an easy thing to do? You're kind to me, I'll be kind to you, right? When we talk about power and privilege, it's not whether we have power and privilege or not. Whether, particularly when people talk about like this white privilege stuff, it's not if we have it or not. It's actually what do we do with it that becomes important. So the so-called black privilege I may have, it's not that I have it, or the male privilege I may have. It's not that I have it. It's what do I do with it. And so when we think about this idea of respect, all too often we try to apply that in other ways and say that. I will only give it, someone has to earn it, right? So again, back to those middle schoolers. I remember I had a middle schooler from Chicago. He was 6'2", 350 pounds. He stood in front of the door and he said, Mr. K, that's what they called me, you got to earn my respect. This is a middle schooler. He was an 8th grader. He's telling me I got to earn his respect. So I asked him some very poignant and specific questions. I said, sir, if I have to earn your respect, where is the syllabus? I said, sir, when is the final exam for me to earn your respect? because that premise of earning respect is a moving target, right? So what is respectful today might not be respectful tomorrow. Calling a group this today, or I may have to call them something else tomorrow. And some people get caught up in, what do I call them? What are the rules? When in fact, what they should get caught up in is, how am I giving respect, even if I don't understand everything, right? And so the student kind of shrugged his shoulders, and he sat back in the back of the classroom, and we talked about respect. And so I'll relate this story. I was in a bar restaurant. It was a Saturday morning, right around 10 o'clock. And so I go into there to grab my lunch because I'm going to be doing some errands and running stuff. And in this particular restaurant establishment, there was a guy who was red-faced and drunk. 10 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. So there's a lot of things that I already know about this guy. I know about his status in this bar restaurant. They obviously know him and feel comfortable with him. This is his home. And so I'm just mindful of that. And so I closed my menu after I made my order. And as soon as I close my menu, the guy moves and sits right next to me. Now, I don't know about you. I'm not afraid of anyone. I don't think all I have are friends, right? So strangers are friends I haven't met yet. And so he sits down next to me, and we do this thing in Minnesota that starts off the conversation. Any conversation you meet with a stranger, you start talking about what? The weather, right? So we talk about the weather, and we're talking about the weather, and then he breaks into the thesis of his conversation. And he says, I don't like, and he uses the N-word, right? So he says, I don't like the N-word. Now, I don't know about you, but that's one heck of a conversation starter. I'm not sure where you go with that, right? And my inclination is to back away from that. But something told me to lean into that. And so I said, sir, when you use that word, when you use the N-word, what are you talking about? And he says, I'm talking about ignorant, uneducated, people living off the system, blah, 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 blah. And so I said, sir, well, do you know any white people who fit that description? And he said, yeah. I said, how about those twins, right? So we started talking about the baseball twins and that kind of stuff. And then he leans over to me and he says, you know what? I don't like, and he uses the N-word again, but I like you. And so now I'm really puzzled about how I should be addressing this guy with these things. And so I said, well, sir, what if all the people that you've met that you think look like me, all the ones you've met that you think look like me, were idiots? And all the people that you haven't met yet that you think look like me are just like me. And he looks at me and he says, I gotta pee. So he gets up and he goes to the restroom, right? And so I get my lunch, I'm headed out the door, and guess who meets me at the door? It is this guy, and he's got water driplets on his face, and he's combing over his hair, and he hands me a damp napkin. And he says, I raise chickens. If you ever need fresh eggs, give me a call. So I take the napkin, I go my way, he goes his way. What happened for him? What do you think happened for him? Well, let's back up. If I had given that guy a piece of my mind for calling me a dirty, nasty name that my mama didn't name me, if I had given him a piece of my mind, what do you think that would have done? Created barriers. I'd have reinforced every stereotype he had about people who he thinks like me. And so when we talk about this idea of respect, when we talk about privilege and power is recognizing that I have these talents, I have the so-called advantage for a purpose, and it's not for me. The purpose may not be for me. And so when we think about power and privilege, it's what do you do with that to make a way for others? What do you do with that to advance others, right? So at the bottom of the paper are the rules of power. Rules without relationship equals rebellion. Rules plus relationship equals respect. Power is the ability to get things done, and empowerment is giving people the power to get things done, right? And so when we talk about privilege and power, I think American Idol has really done a number on people, because it's gotten people to think that their gifts and their talents are for their for their glory, when in fact we should be thinking about how can we be of service to other human beings, right? On page 4 in your handout, you will see Plato's allegory of the cave, and these are typically some of the things that if you read, how many people are familiar with that story? Okay, so please read it. It's a classic story, but I want you to, as you're reading that story, I want you to think about what are some of the things that keep people in caves, right? In proverbial caves. What makes people say that I don't want to share, or I'm afraid to act in a different way? Because we oftentimes find ourselves in these cave-like situations. And so at your convenience, feel free to read this Plato's allegory of the cave and think about what is the responsibility that people who have so-called privilege and have so-called power, what is their responsibility to others, and what are the risks that are involved with using your power and privilege? And ultimately, is it worth it? And I would suggest that many people have found that it is not worth it, but those of us who have really recognize profound and impacting change. So on page 5 is, what are some of the barriers to, so what are the things that we have to use our power and privilege to either protect or provide skills around? And that's this adverse childhood experiences, right? And so what this suggests is that there are things that happen early in our lives that add to the risks of not being able to move from here to there. And so as people who have power and privilege, we must offer opportunities, hands up, hands out, to assist people so that they can be resilient as they're addressing these forces that are impacting their lives. At the bottom of page 5 are some things that we need to be cognitively aware of, and this idea of steeplechases, right? I used to love that with the wide world of sports. They would have these steeplechases, and they show horses or humans going over all of these obstacles. And so privilege is recognizing that for some of us, we have more obstacles to go over than others, not as from a victim standpoint, but as a person who is rising above those challenges. The recognition of the things that I've had to do to get to where I am or where other people are should be taken into consideration as we interact with people. And moving away from this concept of what is wrong with you to actually what has happened to you, right? Because we're all looking for safety, significance, and belonging. However, how we get that is very different. If you look on page 6, turn over to page 6, there is Dr. Martin Luther King's mountaintop speech. And what he suggests is that the work is bigger than him, that he is a part of a long line of people who are looking to raise the human consciousness to the best that we can be as human beings. And how did people respond to Dr. King's messaging around we can do better, we can be different? How did the world respond to him? Much like they did. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. In terms of, yep. So his so 1968, he did not meet a natural death, right? And so all too often, people will say, we would rather kill the messenger than to actually listen to and adapt to the message. And so those of us who have power and influence, we have to continue those things because it's not just about us, right? And so all the people listed here are people who continue the work, right? So Mahatma Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Lutheran in Nazi Germany, who fought the Nazis and challenged them in some pretty profound ways. Nelson Mandela, Mala Yousafzai, who was a Afghan woman who went to school and was shot in the head for going to school. Harriet Tubman, Cesar Chavez, and Dr. King. And these were all individuals who could see the importance of using their privilege and power to raise humanity and not just for themselves. What we also recognize is that impact versus intent is extremely important. So we have laws that measure impact. And so if someone is assaulted or someone has done some kind of hate crime, there are laws to protect folks who have been victimized by those things, right? With people who have breached kind of that social contract. But if a person commits some kind of sexual harassment or act or whatnot, and they come back later, during the investigation or during being called out on that, and they say, ha, 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 I was just joking. Does that change the nature of anything? Does that change anything, the fact that they were joking? That they didn't intend to cause harm like that? I would suggest no. However, intention is important when we're in relationships with one another, right? And so if as a black man, if I am in relationships with someone and they don't use the right terms or whatnot, I will be much more forgiving because we have a relationship than I would if we didn't have a relationship, right? And so those are things to recognize, that relationships are important, particularly as it relates to the impact that we have on individuals. On the previous page, we talked about rebellion, and that was a lack of relationship, right, in accordance to rules. And at the bottom of page 6 is just a self assessment that you can take in terms of understanding the impacts of some of the things that we do. So microaggressions are all those small things that happen. They're not illegal, but they can sometimes be annoying. And discretionary effort is the amount of work that we want to put into a project. Implicit bias or unconscious bias are those things that we're not aware of, where cognitive awareness is our awareness. And conflict and communication are extremely important. The less communication you have, the more conflict you have, and the more communication you have, the less conflict you typically have. And the same with attitude and accomplishing goals. And then finally on page 7 are just some tips and things to think about as you start checking your own privilege and power. And so assume nothing. Learn more about yourself. Understand how or where you and your people have gained privilege and power, and then think about ways that you can expand that privilege and power to folks who may not have had those same types of advantages and in situations. A great example is looking at redlining, right? So redlining is the practice of carving out parts of our cities to prioritize racial groups. And so in black or mixed or low income neighborhoods, and I'm sure we can all think about those, there are typically boundaries around those. There are features around those. And I typically talk about the hood as existing because the good side of town exists. And so, particularly when we talk about public education, should we not all, particularly if we all pay taxes, shouldn't all of our schools, all of our universities have the same level of excellence in resources and teaching as all others, but we recognize that that is oftentimes not the case. And so our job as people with privilege and power is to recognize those discrepancies and use our influence to close those gaps. My name is Andre Koen. I want to say thank you so much for your time. Have a great day. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them on the link. Thank you so much. Have a great day. You're so welcome. Oh, definitely, definitely. Alrighty. Bye.